got to start. We've got a session here on the case for trade, or perhaps more rightly nowadays it should be called the case of trade, since we're living in a rather different era from the one of, let's say, 1994 after the Uruguay completed until the financial crisis. I've been following trade very closely since the 1970s, when I worked on it at the World Bank. So this is a case, something very much close to my heart. I even wrote a book in favor of globalization, Last Living Human Being, I think, falls into that category. Anyway, so there are some very, very big issues going on in this area, and I think we're going to have a very exciting discussion of it, at least I hope so. Obviously, there have been concerns about rising protectionism, including populist reactions to what's been happening in trade. This has occurred in many, many countries, but including systemically immensely important ones like the US. There's been concern about what's happening at the WTO and its effectiveness as an institution. There are absolutely central issues, perhaps the most important dimension, or one of the most important dimensions of the relationship between China and the West, and China and the US in particular, but China and the West. And so the future of the world order in relationship to trade is clearly a fundamental issue. More recently, we've had COVID, which has raised profound questions about supply chain vulnerabilities, raised the notion of friendshoring and other issues. And most recently of all, and as you can see this in the US and Europe, in many different ways, a sort of genuine revival of industrial policy ideas and the idea of subsidies to promote industrial change and protect industries from disaster. And that's clearly going on in both the US and Europe. And we've heard that, for instance, Ursula von der Leyen said implies that. So this is a really big question is, what is the future of world trade and the future of this? And in the background, we're going to have other discussions. There's obviously very important issues now about the role of labor and the impact of trade on labor. And we've had those discussions here before. So I think this is a really important subject. And I have a really wonderful panel. So I'll just introduce you very briefly. To my left is Catherine Tai, as I'm sure you all must know, is United States Trade Representative and therefore is the representative of the US truly in trade negotiations. And that goes, I think, back to the Kennedy round. I think so. So with very distinguished predecessors, as we were discussing. Yes. And Catherine has obviously come to this position at an absolutely pivotal time for her country and the world. Next to her is An-duk Gyun, Minister of Trade for the Republic of Korea. I actually first visited Korea in 1972 in a World Bank mission and became absolutely overwhelmingly impressed with the country's trade performance, which has been spectacular over all those years. To his left is David Schwimmer, who's Chief Executive Officer of the London Stock Exchange. And to his left is Veronica Nilsson, who's Acting General Secretary of the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, who is from Sweden, which might, in this case, turn out to be very important. So let's start off with you, Catherine. Each person here will have up to 4 minutes, not longer, to discuss the main issues. So if you just sort of lay out, what is the US trying to achieve in world trade, and how does this fit in with the Biden agenda? What are the key points of your agenda?
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Martin. It's wonderful to be here with you, with my distinguished friends and fellow panelists, and with all of you. This is my first trip to Davos. I've understood it's pronounced Davos. And I've heard so much about this, and I'm delighted that both with pandemic management and recovery, and with the all of the technologies that we have today, that we are able to convene. Let me take up your question, which is, what is it that we're trying to do in trade?
Yep.
Well, first is we're absolutely committed to supporting trade and economic activity. We are committed to creating opportunity. In fact, we would like to take the focus hitherto of the global economic order and the world trading system as it is, simply to increase prosperity, to take that to the next level, and to think about what other purposes that prosperity is serving. Not prosperity for prosperity's sake, prosperity for the opportunity for people to pursue their ambitions, to realize their potential, to provide for their children. In short, to make the world a better place, to make living a better experience. And so what we talk about in terms of President Biden's instruction to me is the creation of a trade policy that is worker-centered. So let me take a little bit of time to talk about this, because this really is central to the guiding spirit of how we are conducting our trade policy, how we are engaging with our partners and our friends, how we are trying to create that economic opportunity. I think that the World Economic Forum is an institution that is associated with a very specific kind of globalization. And I want to take a pause here and talk about the fact that there has always been some version of globalization for as long as human beings have been interacting with each other and have established economies. This particular version of globalization, though, I think is in the process of evolving. There is a world economic order that is changing. And I just want to point out that in this era of this version of globalization, there has been a tremendous amount of prosperity that's been produced. If you look at the statistics and the GDP numbers and spend some time on the World Bank website, you will see these increasing numbers worldwide. Incredible growth in certain parts of the world especially. It is really inspiring. On the other hand, I think that you made reference to populist reactions to this version of globalization. I think the lesson that we are taking is that this version of globalization is running into some limitations. Enormous amounts of prosperity without an inclusiveness that comes with it. Rising inequality in many different economies is driving a desire on our part to lead the conversation and to lead the thinking around what a new version of globalization might be, what a new economic world order might look like, that builds on what we've just experienced, but more importantly, learns lessons. And I think that one of the most important lessons is, let us not, in this version of globalization, lose sight of who we want to benefit from our vision and from the economic opportunity that we want to create. And that is, let us not lose sight of the people that comprise all of our economies, who are not just consumers, but who are also workers, who are also family members, community members. Let's look at the quality of the prosperity that we are creating and ensure that we can further development in a positive way. So I'm delighted to take part in this panel and take the opportunity to explain to this very important audience how we are looking at the world, how we are looking at trade, and how we are trying to learn lessons from a number of very painful years that I think have caused all of us in leadership positions, whether it's in the business world, in government, in civil society, to really press ourselves to think about how can we do better, how can we learn lessons.
Okay, we'll come back to the details implication, but that's a very good statement of the philosophy.
Thank you.
So, Minister An, what is Korea's approach? And do you go along with this idea that the old model didn't work very well for the people who mattered? Is that the same sense in Korea? Or did you actually rather like the old model?
Well, because of pandemic and the military risk in Russia, in other places, and many other the diplomatic risk, we are encountering huge difficulty in managing the supply chain. Actually, your question, what we are doing in Korea is probably the question for rest of us, other than the US or EU or China. We have huge dependence on trade, and what can we do? Actually, what we try to do is to diversify and make a more flexible supply chain and industry ecosystem. So we try to reach out as many trading partner as possible. So, of course, we try to strengthen our strategic alliance with traditional trading partner like US or EU or other country, but we now try to reach out the other areas, so like even Africa or the Latin America or Central Asia. So. Instead of using the conventional tool of like a free trade agreement, that seems to emphasize like a market opening and the selling more product to the other country, we try to emphasize economic partnership. So we try to use now economic partnership agreement, and using that terminology, we try to reach out as wide as possible to prepare more flexible and diversified supply chain for our country. Probably that is the mission for many countries in the world trading system nowadays.
Okay, so David, could you talk a bit about what you think the issues are, and if you were being asked by the USTR, which I presume you are constantly, or perhaps not, and you had the objective of changing the emphasis in world trade policy, what would you like her and her government to be doing?
So as the private sector representative on this panel,
Absolutely.
And I can't presume to speak for the private sector, but I'll share our thoughts as a global multinational. We've heard from our first two panelists in terms of changes in the trade environment, changes in globalization. And what that clearly feels like for the private sector is greater fragmentation. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, and it's a common narrative now, but greater fragmentation in terms of capital flows, greater fragmentation in terms of supply chain risks around these issues. I'd also like to touch on another topic that doesn't get quite as much attention as those two, which is digital trade. And digital trade has been a huge growth area over the number of years, where it's an area where we've seen the benefits of technology and driving innovation, and that has led to opportunity and prosperity in a number of areas driven by that trade. Martin, you said we had to talk about some of the problems associated with digital trade, and I will touch on that right now, which is we are seeing that kind of fragmentation play out in digital trade as well, and in data flows. And it doesn't get as much attention, perhaps because it is not a tangible good. It doesn't get as much attention as you might see in supply chain issues or fragmentation of other areas of more tangible goods. And so just to give an example on this, we are seeing data localization requirements in countries all over the world. And this is playing out, I would say, very publicly in, for example, areas around data localization requirements in countries like China. But we're also seeing data localization requirements in many, many other countries around the world. This is not limited to one or two countries in the world. And this can have a significant impact in a number of areas. For example, a small business looking to, a small fintech looking to take advantage of accessing the cloud and the capabilities that that would bring in terms of access to large amounts of data, analytics in a cloud, that could be limited by data localization requirements. So we see this as a significant area of concern. We think it's important that it gets more of a focus and a spotlight. If you look at some OECD data, there is a potential for digital trade to be larger than tangible trade or trade in goods by 2025. But when we see these data localization issues or other restrictions on digital trade, that can have a meaningful impact in terms of limiting or restraining growth. So a big area of focus, I would say, for us and certainly for a number of other members of the private sector.
Okay, then Veronica, if I may, I would imagine that what you heard from Ambassador Tai was music to your ears.
It was.
You've been waiting for somebody to say things like that from a powerful country for, well, I don't know, not you personally, but people in your organization, probably for about 40 years. And so this is music to your ears, I imagine. But let's get to the concrete, because that would help in our subsequent discussion. When you hear what she says, what do you think it should mean? And is there enough being talked about by her and other powerful people, the EU and so forth, which actually answers your concerns in this area?
Well, I totally agree. We are very, very happy to have a trade policy which is worker-centered. But what does it mean in practice? That's, of course, a challenge. And I also listened to the Spanish Prime Minister yesterday when he talked about trade, and he said that we need to rethink trade policy. Again, we agree, but what does it mean in practice? I think the changes we have been advocated for and some of the changes we have seen, some of the improvements are, I'm afraid, cosmetic changes. I mean, we've been calling for labor clauses in trade agreements for a very long time. We do have labor clauses, but they haven't really delivered. They are very difficult to implement, so they haven't really had a big impact on workers. We have also called for binding legislation on due diligence, for example. Countries have taken measures in these areas as well. I think France was probably the first country that adopted legislation in this area. Germany just did. They have a new piece of legislation that entered into force the 1st of January this year. So there are things being done. But I think what is really key for unions is about collective bargaining and social dialogue. There are studies that show that trade has a negative impact on working conditions and wage. I was just looking at a study before coming here, which was published last year from a French institute, and they had calculated a decrease in wages of 10%, hourly wages, but that was for Eastern Europe. I mean, I know we don't have time to go into details, but there are such studies, but there are also other studies that show that when you have higher collective bargaining rates, you can also the workers can benefit from the gains from trade. So therefore, collective bargaining and social dialogue is so important. And as you know, the trade union membership has decreased for a number of years. We see that the collective bargaining coverage is being eroded as well. So I think that if we want to make trade more worker-friendly, we also need to focus much more on social dialogue and collective bargaining. And we have, through many, many years, 40 years maybe, as you mentioned, we have seen how many governments have taken deliberate measures to dismantle industrial relations, collective bargaining institutions, and we need to rebuild those. I think if we have strong strong social partners that can negotiate working conditions, we can also much more benefit from trade, because of course we do need trade. There's no doubt about it. But it's all about how the competition is being made. We don't want to see competition on the basis of exploiting workers. I mean, basic things like there shouldn't be any competition or there shouldn't be any products and services being produced by slave labor, child labor, or by violating workers' rights, for example. That's so basic, yet it's so difficult to implement.
Okay, I think we've had a wonderful, given the limited time, sort of introduction to major issues. So what we'll now do is let's discuss some of these, and we will hope the opportunity of at least one or two questions at the end. So if you want a question, remember to think about it. I know the difference in a question and a statement. The question ends with a question mark, and all good questions can be asked in one sentence, I promise you, because that's what I do for a living. So please think of that when you imagine your question. So let's start with you, Ambassador.
Yes.
I'm interested in your reactions to what's been said in different ways. The last speaker, Veronica, said these are cosmetic changes. Show us that they're real. And what are you doing that makes them real? And what are the implications of that? Minister Ahn brought out, I think, a very important issue, and he did it in different ways, but basically there are the superpowers, the big three, and then there are lots and lots of smaller open economies, tremendously open to trade and worried what's going on. And there's the real shock element of it, and there's a trade policy shock element. And so how do you make people like the Koreans and your other friends and other trading partners that depend on Vietnam and many others actually feel that what you want to do domestically is also going to not destroy them? You know, how do you relate your domestic priorities, workers are all very clear, with the aspirations of countries to grow through trade? And then, of course, David was talking about digital trade and the role of digital trade, and more broadly about the concern that what's going on is a fragmentation process, and nobody knows where it ends. And that creates radical uncertainty for business. And that's also important. So you can't discuss every aspect of this, but each person has raised a really quite important question. So how would you address those very clear concerns?
So let me take a couple of the prompts. And
Of course.
I do feel like I'm being graded. In fact, it's clear everybody here is being graded. So I'll try to stay within the time.
You're not being graded at all, I promise you.
Just don't ask me to write
anyway,
an essay at the end.
You're all alpha, I promise. But
Yes.
No, I just want you, these are really important issues, as you know better than I do.
So let me share with all of you a set of experiences that I've had. So sometimes I find myself in forums like this one, surrounded by very influential, extremely thoughtful people. And I never lose an opportunity. I never want to lose an opportunity to have this engagement. But I will tell you that two highlights in my career so far as U.S. Trade Representative, which I think distinguish me from all of my predecessors, is that I was early on in June of 2021 invited by then President of the AFL-CIO, Rich Trumka, whom we lost in August of 21, to give a speech on worker-centered trade at the headquarters of the AFL-CIO. A tremendous honor. Because it demonstrated a trust and a partnership from one of our leading labor organizations to craft a trade policy together. Last August, I was invited by the president of the United Steelworkers to address steelworkers at their annual convention in Las Vegas. it was 2,000 or 3,000 members of the union. I've never spoken to in person an event and a group that large. There's a different energy in the room than here at the WEF, but also an incredibly important audience for our vision for trade. On the innovations that we are trying to make substantively on trade, let me take an opportunity to address what we are doing. The USMCA remains a bedrock foundational touchstone for us on concretely what worker-centered trade means. If you look at that agreement, let me point out the pieces of it that were critical to garnering robust support from the Democrats in the House and the Senate, the support of the AFL-CIO and many of its affiliates, which is very high standard labor commitments, enforceable not just through a state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism, but also a facility-specific, labor-specific mechanism that allows the United States and Mexico to partner to reinforce the implementation of Mexico's labor justice reforms. And that mechanism, which we call the rapid response mechanism, has been triggered 5 or 6 times so far. In each instance, we have either on our own or through a partner learned of the likely denial of rights to collective bargaining or the freedom of association at a specific facility in Mexico, and it has allowed us to intervene to trigger the mechanism, working again with the Mexican government. In each of those cases, that mechanism has assisted the workers at that facility in electing an independent union, in adopting a collective bargaining agreement that reflects their views, and in securing higher wages and better benefits. So, real changes on the ground, on the theory that empowering the workers in Mexico makes Mexico a more secure place for investment. From a North American competitiveness standpoint, helps to ensure that the standards and rights that American workers have, Canadian workers have, cannot be eroded through exploitation in Mexico, given that we have for 30 years now been in a free trade and economic zone together. So that's one instance. Another instance is on forced labor. I believe at this point, the United States and Canada are the only countries in the world that have a complete ban on imports that are produced in whole or in part using forced labor. We are it is clear in the international forums in our conversations that no one stands for slave labor. And everyone knows that the right answer is global supply chains should not be built on the exploitation of human beings in that very, very gross form. However, how do you implement this? For us, it is a complete ban, and there are challenges in terms of implementing and enforcing at the border. We are delighted to be working with partner countries who share our vision, but who have different systems, who are coming at this through a due diligence perspective, which is the requirements to know what your supply chain looks like, how your goods are being produced, and whether or not forced labor is being employed at any stage, and to assess where that liability should be, again, to work together to ensure that globalization is not built on the backs of unwilling and vulnerable people. So those are a couple examples in terms of the heft that we bring to our worker-centered trade vision. And I can tell you every counterpart that I have, including Minister An, will engage with us on how to advance this particular vision. Because at the end of the day, I think that this new version of globalization we're working towards, especially coming out of these years of disruption because of war, geopolitical tensions, supply chain disruptions, natural disasters, knowing that there is an increasing climate crisis that is going to impact markets and livelihoods, that we need a global trading system, we need policies that are going to promote resilience, sustainability, not just for the planet, but also for our people, and inclusiveness. And it is hard because this requires change, but the world is changing anyway. There is an opportunity for us to get ahead with a vision for positive change and to work together with our friends and our partners, because every one of my colleagues who is an economic policymaker, a trade policy leader, is trying to do exactly the same thing, which is to serve the interests of the people in their economy.
Let me ask, if I may, Veronica, I'll come back to you, because Ambassador Tai has clearly addressed your concerns. So I'd be interested in two questions. I just want to, one of which is quite a big one, but pretty fundamental. So first of all, I'd be very interested in your reaction to what the ambassador's just said, and how far you think the concerns she's put forward as implemented in the US MCTA, isn't it?
MCA.
MTA. So they dropped.
They dropped the trade. It's
MCA.
MCA.
Sorry,
yes.
I thought so. I'll come to this in a moment. I think it's very interesting that very interesting. It was negotiated under the Trump administration, of course, with congressional involvement. Because the point is, there's a sort of bipartisan aspect of this, which is very, very important to understand. But anyway, first question: how do you react? Does this go in the direction of you want? How much more would you want? And the second question, I just want to be really clear on. You said. You made a great, understandably, and it fits in with what Ambassador Tai said about the AFL-CIO and the steelworkers. I knew Mr. Trumpet, by the way. I met him on a couple of occasions. So take the logic of your position. Do you think that if that Western countries, or countries that recognize the rights of labor to organize collectively, should cease to trade with China? Finish. Just cease. No, that's a logical implication. So those are my two questions.
Well, the first one is easy.
Well, the second one wasn't meant to be easy, but it's the logical implication.
Yeah. Well, on the first one, when I made my introductory remarks, I was referring particularly to Europe, because I'm European, I'm Swedish, as you mentioned.
And European trade involves the world.
No, it does, but my experience are mainly with European free trade agreements, and there I see lots of things that need to be done. So we are very positive about the changes that have taken place in the US, and I think that they could be a model for Europe as well. So it's definitely something that I believe European countries, EU and so on, should look into this more, what can be done, because the clauses we have today in the European free trade agreements, in my view, they don't work. That doesn't mean that we will stop here, because also one of the points I made before was the need to support freedom of association, collective bargaining, and that was also mentioned by the trade representative. And here governments could do much more, and I was also delighted to hear the German Labour Minister in the panel, the session just before, also talking about the importance of collective bargaining and supporting that the governments have a job to do. It's not just to leave it to social partners, but also to support social partners in doing this job. Now, the second question is, now you really put me on the spot. I'm not sure what to say. I might have a personal view, and then we have official views of the trade union organizations as well. As I said before, we should not accept trade in goods and services, which is made on the exploitation of workers. So, in these cases, there shouldn't be any trade. That doesn't mean that everything which is produced in China has been done through slave labor, for example.
Clearly not.
But there are such cases.
But
so how do you single out then those
is
cases from others? That's a tricky question.
Okay, I agree completely. Of course, the slave labor question in the Chinese context is very specific. Well, it has been very specific. We know what that is. But more broadly, I mean, there isn't free collective bargaining in China. It's a matter of principle. So that raises a pretty big issue, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay, so we'll move on to note that, and I'll come back to this. Minister Ahn, you raised an absolutely central issue, which is supply chain vulnerability, and you've been very much involved. You're a very important part of the global supply chains on both sides. I mean, really important part. And you supply a lot of stuff which is very important. So when you look at this as a policy question, not as a what business should do question, because business will do whatever it does, as a policy issue from the Korean point of view, what do you want to see done to deal with the supply chain issue? Do you want governments to decide this country should be in the supply chain because it's reliable and friendly, and this shouldn't be? What do you think the right policy response, from your perspective, is to this quite understandable concern about the reliability of supply chains?
So as I mentioned, basically what we try to do is to provide more flexible and more diversified options for the business communities.
Of course.
So we try to reach out other countries and try to have the new kind of the trade relationship. Previously, it was a question of whether we have FTA or not.
Okay.
But to have FTA, it takes a whole lot of political capital because it takes a lot of market access negotiations. But we now try to have like a trade investment partnership framework, for example. Without talking about the tariff reduction or negotiation, we try to emphasize like development cooperations or digital cooperations, green technology cooperation, or even bio economy partnership. So we try to reach out many countries, and we try to basically provide the business community more flexible and more options to take. So in case we have some issue with the supply chain disruption, with whatever reason, even climate change issue or some military aggression, whatever, then we try to basically provide another option with some new trade partners. That is basically we try to do as a policy.
So it's almost linked in with development policy. I mean, you're trying to find relationships within an institutional context which integrates your business with other economies that are of some importance.
Right.
Okay. That makes sort of sense. So, David, the last word before we go to the audience. So you started raising the concern about fragmentation. Do you feel better about it now than you did half an hour ago, or even more anxious?
I would say I'm not convinced that we have found the resolution. So.
Well, I think that's fair. So let's just follow up that with one. So let's suppose you were having a conversation with ministers here, and they don't need to answer now because we probably won't have the time, alas. So what do you think they really should bear in mind if they're going to meet their objectives, which are their objectives, legitimate, democratically elected governments, while minimizing the fragmentation problem? Yeah. What should be from representing business in broad sense, but accepting their objectives? What should they be trying to do, or perhaps more important, avoid?
So if we maintain the focus on digital trade for the purpose of this question.
Yes, why not?
And I think there is an opportunity. First of all, countries, governments have a legitimate interest in national security issues around their data.
Of course.
They have legitimate interest for their citizens in terms of privacy. If you look at the Venn diagram, though, I mean, there's plenty of other room for very reasonable, very practical agreement around how there can be digital trade and movement of data across borders that does not raise concerns around national security issues, does not raise concerns around privacy issues. And I think that very broad area is the opportunity set. We would like to see, and a number of companies in the private sector are involved in pushing for this, we would like to see a forum, whether it is the G7 or another forum, come together and take a coordinated policy approach on this. The G20 could be another, but there's some challenges with the G20's finding agreement among its members at this point. But finding a sense of cooperation and a consistent approach across that forum that can then attract other members, other governments to aligning around this. And then another area where I think there's a real opportunity, and the minister touched on this to a certain extent, there are some great examples of free trade agreements that address digital trade. And just to pick out a couple, the UK and Singapore have an excellent one. The US and Japan have an excellent one. And so there are opportunities like that. It is a little bit less efficient to do that on a bilateral basis on the global stage. So we would like to see that kind of cooperation between business and governments in the context of some kind of G7 type forum, as well as more of the bilateral agreements.
So one implication of what you're saying is that in the end it would really be quite helpful if there was a degree of multilateral agreement, and that even the USMCA is an example, even though it's quite a small group. So I'm going to take a couple of questions. Be very, very quick. Explain who you are. Okay, you here. Yeah, say who you are, a one-sentence question.
Yes, so I am Jan from PPF Group, conglomerate from Czech Republic, but having 50,000 employees in Asia. So basically the discussion, especially from the ladies, is important for us. And the question is, when we are thinking about labor laws and slavery, etc., how to report it in some globally standardized manner. So basically everybody will see whether you are doing a good job or not. And with the rise of ESG, wouldn't it be possible to a little bit but not only do E as an environment, but with the rise of social taxonomy, European Union CSRD regulation, so whether to use ESG as a standardized form, how to report about all these things. This is made for Mrs. Nielsen and for Mrs. Stein.
Okay, well, then, and the lady over here, please.
Yes.
You've probably got a microphone coming to you. If you just say who you are and ask the question.
Julia Horowitz with CNN. There's been a lot of conversation at Davos this year about nearshoring and friendshoring. I understand some of the political arguments for moving forward with those types of arrangements, but I'm wondering if there are thoughts on any negative economic consequences, such as for inflation.
Such as?
For inflation.
Okay. So let's start with I'll start with you, Veronica, if I may, on the first question. How do you improve, clarify, and standardize reporting in the area you're concerned with? Yeah. What would that mean in practice for business and presumably policy agreement?
Yeah. That's a very difficult question, because many of these social audits, they don't really have the competence to look into, for example, violations of labor rights, because they don't have enough knowledge about these issues, and this is something that trade unions have highlighted many times. And that's why I would go back again then to worker representation. If workers are free to organize, it's much easier to detect these kind of problems, because they would then come up. But when you have workers which are not allowed to form trade unions, how then can you fix this problem? So it's really back to organizing of workers, letting workers organize, and you will have that information much more readily available. I've seen so many audits where, for example, workers are not free to reply to the questions. They cannot really tell what the conditions are like in the factory, because they will have the manager just watching behind. And in that case, you will not have the full picture of what is happening in a factory. So it's extremely important, and I have doubts about these different reporting mechanisms, I have to say. And I think that the best answer is really to make sure, involve trade unions in this work, and that's also what global union federations, why they have these framework agreements, because they can also help looking at the situation on the ground. They have trade unions all over the world, and I think that's a more reliable source of information to know what is actually happening on the ground.
I'm afraid we're we've got 1 minute left, and I'm going to give Ambassador the last word because the question was addressed to you. I hope you don't mind. I'm very sorry, but this is always going to be very difficult. So nearshoring and friendshoring, what are the economic implications of that? You've got a minute. I suppose part of the question is, what does this mean to you?
Sure. So I think that whether it's in the world of goods trade or services trade or digital trade, part of what we are struggling with right now at this inflection point is trust. Whether or not you trust your partners, whether or not you trust your actors in terms of what they're going to do with the data, whether you trust each other, whether you trust that we are making the kinds of gains with respect to the climate crisis that will allow for a sustainable future for all of us. In that context, we're struggling against this paradigm of efficiency. And I think this gets to your point on fragmentation also. From the business side, I can completely understand an anxiety around, we're looking at a less efficient world. And the world that we have been through has been really about maximizing efficiency. But I think that is part of the point, which is this. You know what's really inefficient is health insurance. I got to pay $50 every 2 weeks, even though I'm healthy. But the logic is that when I do have that crisis, when I inevitably need more and run into a health issue, I have paid into a system that will take care of me, right? And so I think that the way we need to think about it is a less efficient world economic system will necessarily mean that we can't just be pursuing the lowest cost, the maximum cost efficiency. But that premium that is going to come with that extra work that we have to do is really an insurance policy to make sure that we run into problems, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's a tornado, whether it's another epidemic that turns into a pandemic, whether it is non-economically based decision-making that erupts in military incursion, that we're not all there to suffer for it, but that we've thought ahead and that we have systems that can help us bounce back.
I'm going to have to close this. I think we could have had another 3 or 4 hours, but I think the conclusion that I would reach is it's very obvious. The world we're moving into is different from in its assumptions from what they might have been 10 years ago, certainly 15 years ago. But I think it's also clear that there is immense uncertainty about how that's going to evolve within countries and certainly among them, because one reality remains about trade is, by definition, it involves at least 2 sovereigns. And it could involve lots more. And sovereigns have different views of things, and no sovereign can always get its own way. So that creates a complex world, which is why we have international agreements, and we will continue to need them. What they're going to look like and how they will work, that is one of the mysteries we're going to unfold over the next few years. With that, I would thank the panelists. I think it's been a very good discussion. We've raised lots and lots of important questions, and I look forward to further discussions on these issues. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.